8 Japanese cruisers turned east instead of north at 1:40 in the morning, and the American Pacific counteroffensive lost a year. The ships had just finished destroying the Allied cruiser screen off Savo Island in a 20-minute night action that cost the United States and Australia 4 heavy cruisers and more than 1,000 men. Ahead of them, silhouetted against their own burning escorts, lay the transport anchorage off Lunga Point, dozens of unarmored supply ships carrying the food, ammunition, artillery, and engineering equipment of an entire marine division. In the history we know, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa looked at that anchorage, weighed the dawn, and went home. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The setup was real, and it was fragile. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division, under Major General Alexander Vandergrift, had landed on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, seizing the unfinished Japanese airfield at Lunga Point the following day against light opposition on the Guadalcanal side. Taking the ground had been the easy part. Unloading was the problem. By the evening of August 8, roughly half the division's supplies were still in the holds, and much of what had reached the beach sat in unsorted heaps above the waterline, faster to land than to move inland. The operation had been improvised from the start. The Marines called Watchtower Operation Shoestring, and they meant it literally. There was no reserve amphibious lift anywhere in the South Pacific. Then the cover began to leave. On the evening of August 8, Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher informed Vice Admiral Robert Gormley that he intended to withdraw Saratoga, Enterprise, and Wasp, citing fighter losses and fuel. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious force would be left without air protection, and Turner had already concluded he would pull the transports out on August 9th, regardless of how much cargo remained in them. What no one in that anchorage understood, as the last light went out of the sky on the 8th, was that the decision that mattered most that night would be made by a Japanese admiral 80 miles up the slot, and that it would come down to a single guess about time. Mikawa's force had come down from Rabaul and Kavieng. The heavy cruisers, Chokai, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furutaka, the light cruisers, Tenryu and Yubari, and the destroyer Unagi. It was a night-fighting force in the most literal sense. Years of optical training, disciplined lookout doctrine, and the Type 93 oxygen torpedo, longer ranged and faster than anything the Allies believed possible, gave the Japanese Navy a genuine and decisive advantage in a close-range action fought in the dark. Between roughly 0140 and 0220 on August 9th, that advantage was demonstrated with brutal economy. HMAS Canberra, Astoria, Quincy and Vincennes were destroyed or left sinking. About 1,077 Allied sailors were killed, and here the real decision arrived. Mikawa's ships were scattered across several miles of water after their firing runs, torpedo tubes partly empty, formation broken. Reconcentrating them would take time. Attacking the transports would take more. And somewhere to the south, as far as he knew, were 3 American fleet carriers that would put aircraft over Iron Bottom Sound at first light. He did not know Fletcher was already leaving. He weighed a certain further gain against the possible loss of his entire force, and he retired north. In this timeline, he stays. He accepts that his columns will be ragged, orders them east into the roadstead on whatever bearings they can manage, and gambles that a scattered attack pressed home now is worth more than a clean withdrawal. It is not an obvious choice, and it is not an obviously correct one. It is a commander deciding, under real uncertainty, that the target in front of him is worth the risk behind him. What follows takes about 90 minutes. Cruiser main batteries and the last of the torpedoes go into a crowded anchorage of stationary and slow-moving transports and cargo ships, illuminated by their own fires. Some get underway, many do not. By the time Mikawa breaks off and runs for the slot, with dawn coming up behind him, the logistical foundation of the Guadalcanal campaign is burning on the water off Lunga Point. Vandergrift's Marines still held the ground. That was the cruel arithmetic of the morning of August 9. No Japanese soldier had taken a foot of the perimeter, and the division had effectively been defeated anyway. The rations were gone. The artillery reserve was gone. The engineering equipment, the fuel drums, The bulk ammunition, the wire, the medical stores gone, or scattered across the bottom of a sound, the sailors would soon start calling iron bottom. Turner withdrew what was left that afternoon. He had no other option. Ships that could not be protected could not be risked, and the ones still afloat were needed elsewhere in a theater that had nothing spare. In the real campaign, that withdrawal left the Marines with roughly 17 days of reduced rations and limited ammunition. Here, it leaves them with a fraction of that, plus whatever the Japanese had abandoned when they fled the airfield. Vandegrift's men went on half rations, then less. They dug in on a perimeter they could not extend, with mortars they could not feed, and guns whose shells had to be counted individually, and there was no cavalry coming. That is the part that is easy to miss from a distance. The South Pacific, in August 1942, had no reserve amphibious shipping, no depot within reach, no second division waiting to be loaded. What burned that night could not be replaced that year. The consequences of that would take months to fully surface, but the first of them showed up within days on a strip of dirt half a mile from the beach. Henderson Field was never an American gift to the Pacific War. It was a Japanese construction project that the Marines finished with captured Japanese tools. In the real timeline, rollers, graders, and hand equipment abandoned by the Japanese labor troops were exactly what allowed the strip to be brought up to operating condition, and the first aircraft landed on August 20, 1942. Finishing an airfield takes more than rollers. It takes aviation fuel in drums, ordnance, spare parts, steel matting, radios, ground crews, and the ability to feed all of them. Nearly all of that had been in the transports. In this timeline, the captured equipment is still there, and the runway is still there, and neither is enough. The strip gets graded. It never gets supplied. No fighter squadron can operate from a field with no fuel and no bombs, and there is no shipping available to bring either in past, a sound that Japanese cruisers and destroyers now transit at will after dark. Understand what this removes. The Cactus Air Force was the hinge of the entire real campaign, the single reason Japanese daylight reinforcement convoys could not reach Guadalcanal, which is what forced Japan into the slow, cargo-poor destroyer runs the Marines called the Tokyo Express. Take away the airfield and you take away that constraint. Japanese transports can now approach Guadalcanal in daylight, escorted and unload properly. The island stops being a place Japan can only trickle men into. It becomes a place Japan can build up. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army had badly underestimated the Americans in the real campaign, feeding troops in piecemeal on faulty intelligence, most notoriously the Ichiki Detachment, roughly 900 men thrown against a prepared Marine line at the Tanaru on August 21 and destroyed there almost to a man. That pattern of fragmentary attacks repeated for months, and it was imposed as much by the Tokyo Express as by misjudgment. You attack piecemeal when you can only arrive piecemeal. With daylight convoys available, Hyakutake does not have to. He can land in strength, with his regiments intact, with their artillery and their ammunition, and take the time to do it properly. The Ichiki detachment is not fed into a river line alone. Heavy guns come ashore and are dug in on the ridges overlooking the Lunga perimeter, and they are supplied well enough to fire regularly. What follows is not a battle in the sense that Tanaru or Edson's Ridge were battles. It is a siege, an investment of a static perimeter by a force that can be reinforced faster than the defenders can be, grinding inward over weeks while artillery works on positions the Marines cannot move and cannot answer. Vandegrift's division fights well. The Marines were never the variable in this equation, but there is a limit to what discipline does for men who are hungry, out of shells, and shrinking. By late September, the perimeter has contracted to the beach and the airstrip, and Gormley is no longer being asked how to reinforce Guadalcanal. He is being asked whether the division can be gotten off it. Evacuating a division from a hostile shore without air superiority is one of the hardest things a navy can be asked to do, and the South Pacific Command had to attempt it with the ships it had left. It was done at night, in increments, by destroyers and fast transports running down from Espiritu Santo, loading in the dark off a shrinking beachhead and clearing the sound before first light. Every run was a calculated loss. Destroyers were sunk. Men who had held the line for weeks drowned within sight of the boats. Most of the division came off. A substantial part of it did not, and the equipment left behind was total. It was, in the plainest terms, the costliest reverse the United States had suffered in the Pacific War to that point, not in ships alone, but in what it meant, because it was the first American offensive of the war, and it had failed. The strategic response was immediate and unsentimental. The Solomons drive was written off for the year. Gormley's command reoriented on holding the New Hebrides line and protecting the approaches to New Caledonia, and General Douglas MacArthur's New Guinea campaign absorbed the men, aircraft, and shipping that a stalled Solomons offensive released. Papua would be fought and eventually won, but it was now the only Allied offensive in the theater, and Japan knew exactly where to look. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto did, with Guadalcanal, what the original Japanese plan had always intended. He turned it into a barrier. Airfields were completed at Lunga and extended down the southern Solomons, and Japanese search aircraft began ranging deep toward the New Hebrides. Espiritu Santo, which in the real war became the forward base that sustained Guadalcanal, instead became a target under regular air attack, and the effort required to defend it consumed fighter strength that could not then be spent anywhere else. The strategic point of all this was never Guadalcanal itself. Australia's sea lanes to the United States ran through New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and Japanese planning in mid-1942 had aimed squarely at severing them through New Guinea and the Solomons. With the southern Solomons in Japanese hands and airfields operating from them, those routes came under sustained threat for the first time. Convoys did not stop. They lengthened, swinging far to the south into worse weather and longer transits, and every added sea mile meant more escorts, more fuel, more shipping tied up in the same tonnage, moving less cargo. This is not a Japanese victory in the Pacific War. Japan's fundamental problem, an industrial base that could not replace what it lost, is untouched by any of it. But the barrier does the one thing Japan actually needed it to do. It buys time. And in a war of production, time is the only thing the losing side can spend. The Pacific counteroffensive does not resume in 1942. It waits for the ships. Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, Bunker Hill, the new fleet carriers already building in American yards, arrive in the Pacific through 1943, along with the light carriers, the escort carriers, the fast oilers, and, decisively, the purpose-built amphibious shipping and trained landing forces that Watchtower never had. When the drive finally comes, it comes with what the first attempt lacked, and it does not come back through Iron Bottom Sound. It begins further east, in the Gilberts and the Marshalls, bypassing the Solomons barrier rather than reducing it, and it begins roughly a year later than in the record we know. That year is the whole cost. Every subsequent step is displaced by it: the Marianas, the return to the Philippines, the approach to the home islands, all pushed back into a later calendar against a Japan that has had 12 more months to fortify what it holds. The war still ends the way the ledgers say it must. It ends later, and the bill for the delay is paid in the Pacific and in Asia by people who had no say in any of it. And all of it turns on a decision made in 20 minutes of darkness by a man who did not have the information we have. Mikawa retired because 3 American carriers might have been waiting for the dawn. He was wrong about the carriers. Fletcher was already withdrawing, but he was not wrong to fear them. And a commander who bet his entire force on an enemy's absence and guessed badly would be remembered as a fool rather than as cautious. That is what these hinges usually look like from the inside. Not a blunder anyone could see, but a reasonable man weighing incomplete information against a clock and choosing.